Welcome everyone. I am Patricia Santillán Carvantes, and together with Marina Fritsch, I am very excited to welcome you to our third global conversation about social ecological systems. Today we are going to hear about fostering environmental justice in area-based conservation approaches. We will have a panel discussion of researchers working in the topic, and the panel will be hosted by Professor Dr. Jacqueline Loos here in Leuphana University at the SESI Institute. And after that panel, we will engage in an open discussion together with all of you. And with that, I hand the word to Jacqueline.
Thank you very much, Patti. And welcome everybody to our discussion today. Thank you for making the time, and thank you for sharing your associations with protected areas. I read there is this idea of belonging, being part of nature, freedom, peace, but also that there is a healing power in being with nature and that there is a spiritual connection. And also you mentioned some elements of nature around you, such as maybe woodland, forests, or maybe you were thinking of the power of nature, which is, for example, expressed here in this cascade. Or maybe you were even thinking of phenomenal landscapes, or you were thinking of wetlands such as this mangrove system here. Or maybe you traveled in your mind to a mountainous area or a beautiful lake, or you even described salt and wind. Maybe you had a look at colorful corals and fish, or you encountered wildlife and charismatic animals on your trip to a protected area. But also you noted that protected areas are demarcated places that are fenced off and thereby also exclude people entering into this area. And according to the IUCN, this is one of the characteristics of protected areas, that they are clearly defined geographical spaces that are recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means. And that is why we talk about area-based conservation methods here, to achieve the long-term conservation of nature and the associated ecosystem services and cultural values. Globally, the coverage of protected areas has increased drastically over the past years, specifically since the onset of the Convention on Biological Diversity in the early 90s. So that nowadays we have 22.5 million square kilometers of land and inland water ecosystems protected, almost covering 17% of the Earth's surface, and 28.1 million square kilometers of coastal waters and oceans. The post-2020 Convention on Biological Diversity foresees to increase this amount of protected areas up to a 30% coverage. And simultaneously, the target here is to let this happen in a way that protected areas contribute to human well-being, and to do so in an equitably managed way. This is in line also with the Sustainable Development Goals to reduce poverty, increase food security, and to include people into the decision-making. Thus, protected areas are not only places for nature conservation, but also they are expected to serve human well-being. How exactly can protected areas conserve nature on the one hand by excluding people and forbidding entrance and resource extraction, while at the same time asking and inviting for equitable management in the very same area on the other hand? And for this reason, because there are so many questions. I'm very honored that we have a group of people here that work with these questions in one or the other connections. And I'm happy to welcome here Olamido Olapimbo Olaiwola from Leuphana University and the International Sustainable Academy, who has done research in Nigeria on the effect of displacement on local people. Neil Dawson, Dr. Neil Dawson from the University of East Anglia, who has for many years worked with protected areas in several questions of equity. Noelia Zafra Calvo, who is also part, well, she's from the Basque Center for Climate Change and also part of the Future Earth Group and one of the members involved in negotiating these goals of the Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020. Rodan Dina Kahali from Leuphana University and the Department of National Parks and Wildlife in Zambia, who scrutinizes justice and the link to practice on the ground. Arash Kudusi, who investigates protected areas, amongst others, for wildlife conservation and their effectiveness based on empirical research and conceptual considerations, and Marina Fritsch from Leuphana University and the SESI Institute, who also conceptually links insights from interviews from people on the ground with some larger scale interest in fostering justice in protected areas. So welcome all on board. And I would like to start with Ola Mida and to ask you the question, Ola Mida. You talked to local people in Nigeria that were affected by the designation of a protected area, the Osa River National Park. What were your observations and how successful do you think can protected areas be to achieve nature conservation in a fair way?
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Hello, everyone. My name is Olamide Olabipiola, and this question, can protected areas be a just conservation tool, or can protected areas designation serve as a source of better conservation practices? I would answer in two ways. I would say that the designation of protected areas could be just and could also be unjust, depending on what happens with local communities. So recently, I conducted a study on environmental justice and protected areas in Nigeria, and I used the Ose River Park as my case study. So basically, I realized that local communities or local community members actually want better conservation practices. They want to do better for the environment, but they do not want to do this at the expense of their own livelihood. They do not want to do this at the expense of their own happiness. They want to preserve life within protected areas, and at the same time, they do not want to suffer when it comes to their own well-being. So having considered all of these things, current literature would also tell you that the designation of protected areas by itself alone could constitute some sort of injustice. So my point here is that if protected areas would be designated, the designation alone doesn't come by itself. There are some activities that happen during, before, after designation. And after designation, it happens that there is a protected area. It has to be managed. It has to be protected one way or the other. And some of the tools that are used to manage protected areas negatively affect local communities. And from the study that I conducted, if local community members are negatively affected by trying to protect or try to preserve protected areas or try to manage protected areas, they get to see protected areas not as their own project, which means that they see no reason why they should preserve this within protected areas, which means that in the long run, they develop negative attitudes towards protected areas, which invariably affects negatively conservation in that particular community. So what am I saying? If protected areas would be a just tool for conservation, it has to rest a lot on environmental justice, which I used Schlossberg 2007, rests on the equity in the distribution of environmental issues and risks, recognition of the experiences of local communities, and participation fully in the full involvement of local communities in the management, in the designation, and everything related to protected areas. So yes, protected areas could be just or could be unjust depending on what happens with local communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mide. You said it can be just or unjust, which lead me to the next point. Neil, based on your experience and your research, how do you think equity can be obtained in protected areas? And do you think it can be achieved at all?
Thanks very much, Jacqueline. Nice to be here. Yes, I'll try and answer that question in a short space of time and gradually get around to a yes, I think, in certain circumstances. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Yeah, good, great. So from the cases I've worked on and evidence I've kind of reviewed in syntheses, I found a key point of distinction in how area-based conservation works is in the theory of change through which the conservation goals and the social objectives are sought or attempts made to reconcile them. So on one hand, many examples involve quite simplistic ideas. Many protected areas involve simplistic ideas about removing indigenous and local communities from the nature that's then to be conserved through forms of resettlement or somehow altering the livelihoods and values of those communities. And even where a program in a paper or the project is actually labeled as a community-based this or that, or a new RED Plus project with this whole list of social safeguards and principles that are supposed to deliver equity, often the actual theory of change behind that project is that separation of local people. And in terms of justice, those types of approaches, they tend only to have a fairly superficial look at the distributional aspects of equity or justice, and often end up being unjust because they neglect the procedural and recognition dimensions which Olamide has listed and talked about there. In that sense, they deny the existence and importance of the values, the agency, the knowledge systems of those indigenous and local communities. And what's more, again, as Olamide has said, just adding to that, that often leads to ineffective conservation, because implementing these exclusionary projects is somehow, it's unrealistic, it's unimplementable, and it's resisted by local communities in various ways, which to continue supporting their livelihoods and which can undermine the conservation goals themselves. Now, the alternative or counter-narrative to that is embracing complexity more, rather than seeing it as a separation of people from nature, considering the interrelation of the social and ecological dimensions as being mediated by lots of layers of governance, including customary and informal institutions, and seeing those conservation efforts more as a negotiated process across different types of values and involving local influence, and even in the more progressive form, some forms of intercultural recognition. And ultimately that can involve conservation through stewardship, through the actions of local communities themselves. And I think these days there seems to be evidence coming out weekly, if not daily, showing that such approaches tend to produce better conservation outcomes, better ecological outcomes, as well as social. Although it's obviously difficult and far from guaranteed, it's not as simply a process of decentralization. So if a new protected area is being established, and we're in a situation now where a vast amount of the globe is going to be protected or come under protection in the coming years, it seems. If a new protected area is being established, there's no justification not to follow those high social standards and pay attention to all of those dimensions of equity, with indigenous and local communities being at the forefront of those conservation efforts. Now, a problem is the way conservation is set up and who implements conservation, because that more progressive, socially innovative approach tends to go against the structures, the approaches, and the skills within the major organizations which design and implement conservation themselves. So I would say, as well as the kind of legal and policy instruments that are relied on to set up a new protected area. So if suddenly another, 13% of the earth is to become protected areas in the next few years, even within the next decade, there need to be some changes to support a new, more socially progressive form of conservation to happen. Now, something, I'm probably running out of time, but what I find to be very highly neglected in these debates is not just attention to the type of governance that's being implemented, but a debate about governance quality and justice within the 17% of the globe that's already under protected areas. We talk a lot about governance diversity. Like, it's okay for new protected areas to be more socially centered, more progressive, but not so much attention to how we improve equity and effectiveness of protected areas in the existing network, those old ones that were designated long ago, like in the 1990s or something. And even far, far back with very exclusive approaches. So if you view governance as more of an ongoing negotiated process, then that leads you to the goal in those sites being to move more collaboratively towards enhancing equity and effectiveness. And the steps that are appropriate to do that at different protected areas will differ based on the various histories and relationships and pathways available. Rather than that involving a sudden revolution in governance for such a large amount of the earth, which I'm not sure would necessarily end well socially or ecologically. In many cases, it's processes of conflict resolution, trust building, and furthering process of collaboration between different stakeholders that can help move in that direction. And I see positive examples of that from all areas of the globe. It just like that approach to become more mainstream. And then I think justice and equity can be served through protected areas in some way. Sorry if I overran, Jacqueline.
Your suggestion to consider including justice aspect into governance through a negotiated process also reminds me of Zen's approach in considering it not as a generalizable aspect to see what justice is. But also, Noelia, you have been working on measuring whether or not we are on track in protected areas to achieve all these ambitious goals and to integrate that. Which assessment tools are out there and which do you recommend in terms of measuring whether or not protected areas move into the right direction?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. When talking about assessment tool, we need to identify the aim of the assessment. If the assessment is for global reporting, for instance, to report on IC Target 11, there is a simple and easy global online survey, including 10 principles regarding the distribution of burdens and conserved areas, the procedures, how and by whom decisions are taken about the distribution of these burdens and sharing of benefits, and recognition, that is the acknowledgement and representation of different local stakeholders' ability to participate in decision and have their rights, cultural identities, values, and knowledge systems recognize it. This online survey could be responded by already published. If the aim is locally improving social justice and equity in a given place, the principles to be assessed are the same, but the most important is the process. A global online survey cannot work here. In this case, There is a multi-stakeholders tool called SAGE that I invite you to use and explore, which application is a long-term process to determine, assess, and think actions to improve social justice and results has been published for the case of OMEC in Colombia. We are also exploring with Marina, Jacqueline, Arash, and other colleagues indicators about social justice and equity, considering protected and conserved areas as social ecological systems. This is still work in progress, and we'll hope we will publish our results very soon, and this could be also a very useful approach. Well, just to add that all this work is team and transdisciplinary work, and to thank Jacqueline for her invitation and all my colleagues for the advances that we have reached together in this important realm. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Noelia. And yeah, this seems to be a long journey, especially since there is so much different literature also out there from science, but also the question is what we observe from this literature in terms of the ability to harmonize equity and conservation. So Rhoda, you are currently reviewing this scientific literature on protected areas and justice, and at the same time you experience the reality of local communities in your conservation work for the Zambian government. What do you think is needed on the ground to harmonize these two ambitious goals of equity and conservation?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Jacqueline. I just want to highlight a little bit about my work and my work within the project. I've spent 17 years in the wildlife sector in Zambia, and also now working with Jackie on stakeholder effectiveness and justice for governance. So my comments stem from some of that experience, as well as some of the literature that I've looked at. What I want to say is that the justice issues to do with communities that are adjacent to local communities come even before those communities are interfacing with the protected areas. So this is why, in my thinking, you need to go further than sort of looking at the protected areas and interface with the communities in terms of injustice, but also deal with the communities at an individual level. So far, our interventions are dealing mostly at the institutional level and looking at how community-based natural resource management institutions are dealing with governments and are dealing with NGOs, but not at the institutional level that looks at things like elite capture and what kind of power relations are within those communities themselves on the ground. So you also have issues of trade-offs, and there's a need in the academic work that's being done, and also in work that's being done by NGOs and governments, to acknowledge that there are trade-offs and synergies. And we need to not all, sometimes I feel that there's always this perception of that a win-win possibility is always the case. But then I think you're better off saying these are the possible trade-offs, and these are where the synergies are, this is where we can strengthen this. And sometimes nature may have to lose, and sometimes maybe the socioeconomic, we might have to find solutions for the socioeconomic impacts. And then we also have sort of the global to the local. And a lot of times in the literature, you get a critique of sort of this neoliberal capitalist type global system that is working. But I think sometimes what is missing is also a self-critique of, say, the NGOs and what their role is in this system. And also even people who are sort of academic justice practitioners. And we need to realize that we are driving the conversation whether we like it or not, because most of the funding, whether it's from the point of view of people who are studying justice, NGOs, governments, is coming from way, way above these communities. And whoever whoever has the money, usually, their voice is the loudest. So there needs to be a self-awareness about that. I can go to the next slide. So another thing, the second question that you asked about how science can, support practice in terms of reducing inequality. So one of the things that that's highlighted for me was I look at the literature, is that most of the studies are after the project implementation, and people are just looking at what happened in terms of a justice framing. But there is very little that's being done at the planning phase of many projects, whoever is doing it. So that needs to also change and needs to be looked at. And then also in the literature, scientists are talking to only each other. They're not talking to necessarily people who are on the ground, who are practitioners like me, and maybe speaking to the real issues that practitioners are and communities and whoever is interfacing with these things on a day-to-day basis in a more proactive way. And I think that should be thought through. They might be, you need to look outside the literature for that, but at the moment, the literature doesn't really speak to that as much. There's also, like I said before, a need for self-reflection for among people who are studying justice, and to realize that we are imposing our ideas about justice. If you look at the literature, most of it is sort of a Western published authors, or even if they're not from the West, there are people like me who are Western educated, and they are imposing their perceptions of justice and what should be done, what's going forward, what are those things for, and what are those things, what are the definitions of those things for them? And to think about, the context is important, but to think about beyond the context, say, what am I bringing to this? And how am I imposing my ideas of justice? And a lot of times you'll find that some of these ideas are directly clashing, especially on ecological justice and the human rights issue with African communities. I'm not sure about South America and other places, but with African communities, they have different ideas about what's utilization, what ecological justice, what's going on in their societies, and some of these papers are talking about. And so there's the need to bring that into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rhoda. So looking behind the protected area in itself and having a broader look into governance schemes even before making any assessment on the justice implications here is what you recommend, and also that that scientists should require more actionable guidelines for people on the ground to assess the effectiveness of conservation, the effectiveness in protected areas, which is what Arash Guduzi has been working on over the past year. So Arash, which recommendations do you take away from your work?
Thanks, Jacqueline, for having me. It's great to be among you here today. I'm going to talk about this topic and your question mostly related to a recent work that is related to a bit putting together bits and pieces in evaluation of protected area effectiveness from different lenses. And based on this work and looking at what has been done in conservation science so far, it seems that there is a need for better adopting a social ecological systems thinking when it comes to identifying protected area outcomes and evaluating their effectiveness. And this notion that protected areas are embedded in social ecological systems isn't new, and it has been repeated in the literature over years and years, but it seems like it is not yet mainstreamed in conservation planning and evaluation. And that's why we over and over see that protected areas are being evaluated based on single indicators, single measures, usually ecological ones, mostly using data from remote sensing techniques, which are all great. I'm not going to say that these are not useful, but this is not the whole picture that protected areas have, and basically not all the outcomes that they produce. So as you can see in this figure, if we think of protected areas as embedded in social ecological systems, they should include ecological and social components and all the interactions and feedbacks between them. And based on this notion, the evaluations also need to focus on all these different dimensions of protected areas and go beyond looking only at the ecological outcomes such as forest cover or population of megafauna. And this is problematic because such a narrow focus is quite limited and inconclusive, and therefore cannot really disentangle the complex relationships between human nature, many of which were explained in the previous presentations. And therefore my recommendation, or our recommendation based on this work, is that move beyond unidimensional assessments and incorporate social outcomes such as equity and human well-being, as well as social ecological interactions such as human pressures or ecosystem services. And surprisingly, we found that such assessments, so going beyond only one dimension of protected area outcomes, is quite rare, and only 6% of all the assessments that we found in the literature do so. On the positive side, there are exciting developments in tools and approaches for assessing these outcomes. And therefore, for example, from the work of Noelia about equity, or what you will see in a few moments from Marina's work, these tools and approaches should be further practiced and refined in protected areas. So basically, based on this graph and our recent work, we tried to put all of these tools, approaches, and basically worldviews to protected area outcomes together, and we came up with a conceptual framework to how basically more holistically assess protected area outcomes, and brought some examples from around the world. And we believe that such an outcome-oriented and multidimensional approach can basically allow us to fully recognize and evaluate the contributions of protected areas to biodiversity and human well-being. Thank you very much. Happy to chat with you further on this.
Thank you so much, Arash. Yeah, really interesting also to see how little there is out there to empirically investigate some of these indicators in terms of the social work. And just to highlight that there is also other work going on, of course, in the single dimension of how participatory and procedural elements may affect. And I think it's a really upcoming topic, but something that hasn't really been explored is exactly this field of the social ecological indicators. And Marina, you have elaborated a framework in your master thesis based on empirical fieldwork and conceptual considerations. And how do you think this framework, the social ecological framework for interactions in protected area, may help to minimize the injustices brought about by protected area designations and practices?
Yes, thank you very much, and hello everyone. So the most important thing the framework does is bringing together the social and the ecological components of protected areas. As Arash just mentioned, what we see happening quite often is that protected areas are not considered to be social ecological systems, and this neglects the interplays and links between people and the biophysical world. So it's really these interactions between social parts of a protected area and ecological parts that play a very huge role in shaping what is happening in a protected area. So maybe to make this a little clearer to all of you, social components of a protected area might include an individual park ranger or a family living in a protected area. And ecological components are, for example, a forest or a single mosquito. And these components interact. So for example, the family might extract resources such as fruits and timber from the forest. And this in turn might affect species composition in the forest or trigger reaction from park authorities and so on. So speaking about environmental justice, the kinds of interactions that take place, the way benefits and disbenefits of such interactions are distributed among people, how the process of decision-making is designed when it comes to regulating and shaping such interactions, and also whose values and knowledge is considered in this context, all have very strong implications for environmental justice. And this is also reflected in the triangle that you can see here on the right side, which combines the 3 dimensions of environmental justice, namely distribution, procedure, and recognition. And this has also already been mentioned by the other panel members. So with our focus on social ecological interactions in our framework, we were able to gain a thorough understanding of the study protected area in Zambia. And just very generally speaking, such systems are highly complex. And when we want to minimize injustices, we have to account for this complexity. So this includes, for example, identifying different variables that are key to the system, tracking causes and effects of processes, identifying drivers of change, and so on. And this in-depth knowledge of a protected area and of the interactions in this protected area can then be directly used to also think about justice. So we might understand where injustices occur, how they solidify, and what are drivers of these injustices. And this way, we can respond to them in a way that aligns with the reality of the protected area, and in a way that also considers all 3 dimensions of environmental justice. So to put it very shortly, in order to minimize injustices, it's important to really understand the socio-ecological system that we're working in, account for all dimensions of justice, and align the measures and the solutions with the local realities. And by focusing on social ecological interactions, we can really do this because we are allowed to really dive deep into the study system. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to all of your questions and ideas.
Thank you so much, Marina. And I also see that there are a few points coming in here as well from the audience, and that was also our intention here, that we invite people to discuss with us rather than just informing others about what we are going to do. And when I say we, then you can see our group, our panel members here, that we have collaborated in different combinations in the past years, but there are more people included in the work that I currently undertake and that you undertake, of course, many more people, but just to show a few of them, we are having discussions on protected area resilience, on how to increase the justice in protected areas, how to move forward indicators, and also have monthly meetings for global conservation conversations, that if you are interested, please get in touch. And yeah, I invite you to take the chance of meeting the panel members to ask your questions, to add your ideas for this discussion round. And all people that spoke now, I thank you very much for your contribution.